thank you so much for starting us off, Quincy. I feel incredibly honored and intimidated to be on the stage with two people who are people I very much look up to and whose work I admire. And it's a real honor to be in conversation as we think about James Baldwin, who's had this really beautiful moment in American society, particularly in the past few months, in the past couple of years. And I was trying to think if there was anything I had common with these giants. I was made a little less nervous when I realized backstage we are all Village Voice alumni. Steve was the assistant
advertising manager
in 1957. Quincy wrote there in the 70s and 80s, and I wrote there in the 2000s. So I like having 6 generations or 6 decades or so of Village Voice alumni together. I just wanted to start off with, and we'll look at the images and talk about the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century and what we can learn about it from today. But I wanted to start just asking you both, how did you meet Jimmy, as you affectionately call him?
I don't know if this works, or I don't know if it matters. Can you hear me? Yeah, cool. Basically, I had started freelancing for Life, and I read the essay which eventually became The Fire Next Time in the New Yorker in late 1962. And I asked Life if I could do an essay on Baldwin. They agreed, he agreed, and I spent a month traveling with him from Harlem to Durham, North Carolina, to Mississippi, or parts of Mississippi, and to New Orleans. And basically, there's part of this book which is just about Baldwin, and then the rest of the book is really about civil rights in general, because through Baldwin, I met a lot of civil rights leaders, and I started photographing in '63 and continued through 1968, basically from time to time, working basically in the South.
Quincy, how did you meet Jimmy? Other way.
I was living in Los Angeles. I had moved out there after I came back from Europe to do whatever, be a bum or something, I don't know. And I met this man, I was in the watch writer's workshop. And so this man came down to the watch writer's workshop in Watts with a friend of mine, Roscoe Lee Brown, who was a great actor. He brought this little white man down to the workshop. So when we were standing there talking, and he says, "So you want to be a writer and everything?" I never used to like. At that time, I was pretty crazy. So and he asked me a question. He was asking me a question. I said, "So what do you do? What is it that you do? What's your name?" He says, "Marlon Brando." I said, "You're not fucking Marlon Brando." Excuse my language. "You're not fucking Marlon Brando." He said, "Yes, I am." I said, "No, you're not." So we were standing there arguing, and Roscoe Lee Brown's eyebrows went up, and we were arguing. So he says, "Wait a minute." He took out a piece of paper, and he wrote down his address and his name on top of it. So he gave it to me. He says, come to my house on Saturday night. I'm having a party." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." So I showed it to my friend Ojinki, who was a great poet, was first Rastafarian that I knew, and poet. And I said, "Ojinki, this guy, he said he was Marlon Brando, and he lived on Mulholland Drive and everything up in the hills." And so Ojinki he stuttered. He said, well, it might be Marlon Brando living up there." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, let's go up there and see." So I go up there, we drive up there that Saturday night and walk in to this beautiful house, and there he was. He says, now do you believe I'm Marlon Brando?" He was right at the door. "Now do you believe I'm Marlon Brando?" I said, "I guess so." He said, you guess so?" I said, "Yeah, I guess so." I said, "Where's the wine?" So he just looked at me like this. And we walked in, and I got me some wine, and he was like curious. He was looking. And I saw James Baldwin. So I said, wow, James Baldwin is up here. Whoa, this is deep. So I go over to James Baldwin, and I start talking to him. And Jimmy Baldwin looked at me and said, do you believe in the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King? I said, to some extent. He said, what do you mean? I said, I don't believe in nonviolence. He says, you don't believe in nonviolence? That's the only way we can do it. I said, if somebody hits me, I'm going to try to kill them. If they hit me, that's the way it is. That's the way it's going to go. So we argued for about 25, 30 minutes, for 25, 30 minutes. So finally he laid down on the couch like this, because I was just, we were getting drunk and everything. And I thought I had, did him in. So when I was getting ready to leave about an hour or two later, because he avoided me the rest of the evening. So when I was leaving with my friend, I felt this insistent on my shoulder. So I turned around, it was Jimmy Baldwin. He said, and said, young man, I love your energy, but you're absolutely wrong. Absolutely stupid and wrong. He turned around and left. So that's how I met him.
That sounds right.
If you're going to get told off by somebody at a party, I think James Baldwin is the person you want to do it. I'm looking over here. Maybe we can go through some of the images. One of the things I'm really struck by, Steve, in your book is that you write about shooting, taking photographs of these people, particularly Martin Luther King, and you had no idea that they were going to be these luminary figures of American history at the time, right? You're just...
Well, I was starting to work for Life magazine, and basically, as a journalist at that time, you felt, oh, wow, the best that can happen is that the pictures I take today might be in the magazine the next week. And the other thing is you take a lot of pictures when you're photographing an event or something, particularly an event, and you don't know which one is going to really have resonance to that degree. And so very often I've taken pictures which I really loved, which no one else does. And the reverse has happened a lot. In fact, it's happened a lot.
There's such a humanity and an intimacy to a lot of these images, both of famous people that we know well. The book is also full of protesters who we have not heard of. I was particularly touched by the image of a nun that was in here, and we see all kinds of people.
What's interesting is that the picture we're showing right now is actually taken in Brooklyn. And this was a core program. It was a stall-in. The idea was to prevent people from getting into the World's Fair as a protest. So this is basically a New York photograph and not a photograph from the South at all.
Wow. How many people have seen I Am Not Your Negro in the audience? So, okay, good. This is great. So one of the really thrilling things I think about this book is if you've seen I Am Not Your Negro, you learn about how Baldwin is starting to write this book about Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. And he writes about going on this road trip, and you were with him on the road trip.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about...
Medgar Evers?
Well, just tell us about... this is like a trick.
You gonna trick me?
Yeah. Just tell us about... tell us about starting out on the trip, what it was like to go out with Jimmy Baldwin, not knowing what you were going to find yet.
Well, yeah, I didn't know what to expect, really. And there's some people I've met in my life who are crisis prone. And Baldwin was definitely crisis prone. We never made a plane that we were taking anywheres by more than a minute. And very often we had to charter a plane because we missed it. And just in general, there always was that sense that we were on the edge at all times.
Did you find him to be crisis prone as well?
For me?
Yeah.
Not really, because I didn't travel like that with Jimmy. I got to know Jimmy very well, and we got to be good friends. And he lived down the street from me for a while when I moved to New York on 97th Street. So, and I used to see him quite often at McHale's bar, where music used to be. And we used to all meet in there. We'd all meet in there. Yeah, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, myself. We'd all meet in there and drink. And David Baldwin was the bartender. So David Baldwin would give us. We would think we were getting we said, give me a Bloody Mary. We thought we were getting one shot. We get 4 shots. So we were all wondering after a while, why were we so drunk so quick? You know, we have three drinks like that, and everybody's drunk. You know, Baldwin used to come in late. He would always come in late with his coat over his shoulders, and he'd come in waltzing in an hour and a half late, you know, with his friends, and then we'd stay there for another 2 or 3 hours. So that was my kind of, you know, that wasn't crisis prone like Steve trying to catch planes and all that.
The body of work that you're showing in the book reflects. I can't do this if it's going on enough. Should I just stop it? I'm just going to talk without it. So the body of work has all these really beautiful things about it. One of which is that it's showing something I found when I've worked in the South and talked to people who were involved in the Civil Rights era, that there was actually a lot of joy as well as a lot of hardship. And I think that you capture these really beautiful, happy moments.
Well, we're talking about a movement that was church-oriented and was really nonviolent. And I remember seeing a girl in Durham, North Carolina, who pointed to a sheriff near her and said, "You see that man? He caused me to spend 30 days in jail." But it wasn't said with any anger, with any hate, with anything like that. It was almost said with a sense of pride, in the sense that that's what the movement was about. The movement was pointing up exactly the other side of the coin in the South.
We've gotten used to seeing images more recently. We'll get to this later in the conversation, but images more contemporary of Ferguson, of Baltimore, and places where there are huge numbers of people and huge numbers of people with cameras. But you were often one of the only people with a camera, and you write about the terror of both taking photographs of the sites of bombings, of killings. Also, you were near Philadelphia, Mississippi, when Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney were killed. And can you tell us a little bit about coming into that community, hearing the news, and then confirming it yourself?
What had happened was I was at a training session in Ohio for the summer of '64, and the idea of the summer of '64 was that most people who tried to register to vote would not make it. Basically, if you were college educated, there would be something in terms of the qualification things they were asking you, which you possibly could not answer because it was absurd in some way. And the idea was that for most people to attempt to register by themselves, they could easily lose their job, or they could find a cross burning in front of their house, or they could find bullet holes in their house. And so there was a great hesitation, and the idea was by sending people, a lot of people from the North, black students, white students, ministers, by sending people into the small cities or the small towns in Mississippi, they could encourage people to do this much more. So it was sort of at the very end of that, and I was working with a stringer from Old Miss who basically had met me, and I was sort of a New York guy with long hair and a leather jacket, and he took one look at me and he pulled me into a barber shop, and he told the barber that I had lost a bet and to give me a marine haircut. And then he bought me, you know, like a red shirt with an alligator thing on it, and he bought me white corduroy pants and a transistor radio case to put my camera in, and then he felt he could walk on the street with me. So anyway, we drove, and we had heard this church had been bombed out near Philadelphia, Mississippi. And as we were driving there, we did see the church, and it was just leveled, totally leveled. And we heard that these 3 civil rights workers had disappeared and that they had been in Philadelphia, or that's where they were last seen. So we drove into Philadelphia, and the town square was very picturesque and really nice. We parked our car, and I saw this big burly sheriff, at a distance from me, and I started taking pictures of him. And so he came over to me, and he took the camera out of my hand. He opened the back of the camera, pulled the film out, threw it on the ground, and handed me back my camera. And I didn't know how lucky I was, because he was Sheriff Rainey, who was one of the ringleaders in the killing of the 3 civil rights workers. So basically, I think if I had not been working for Life at the time, and if the stringer who was working with me had not gone to Old Miss, and really had a very strong Southern heritage, we could have been in a lot of trouble. Outside of that, we were pretty lucky. At one point, near Jackson, Mississippi, we drove to a place where core workers were really meeting to work in terms of getting more younger people involved. And what would happen is I would take pictures, and he would park the car in the cemetery, and then I would call him on a walkie-talkie, and he'd rush by, and we'd take off. But we were at a motel, and suddenly we got a call that one of the civil rights workers was in the hospital, and they felt that they couldn't go, and they asked us to go, which we did. And as we drove out, another car drove in, and it was the Mississippi Sovereignty Committee, and they took over a room and kept the switchboard open 24 hours so that they could really catch all our calls.
Yeah, I want to ask you a bit more about this. I've been thinking a lot since the election of President Trump.
I bet you have.
Yes. That whatever, in my career as a journalist, and I think the same is true for print journalists and photojournalists, we had a little bit of an advancement during the Obama years in writing about race and racism and having people of color representing. And then when Trump was elected, we've seen a big shift in the media that we really need to get the view of angry white men again. Mm-hmm. And the angry white men are sort of considered this objective positioning. Mm-hmm. And I was really, I particularly, I've been in touch with
36% of the country.
Something like that. And I've talked to journalists, particularly I'm thinking of one, a transgender journalist I know who was actually fired from their job because they wrote this very thoughtful thing about, there is no objectivity in journalism. We all have a subjectivity in some way. And so I was really thinking about that a lot when you write about, you were aware that you were a white photojournalist who was able to go places that the civil rights workers were not able to go. You were able to go into hospitals sometimes or get information for the advancement of freedom in a way that other people were not able to. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how you saw yourself as a journalist in relation to the freedom struggle. And did you consider yourself objective, and did the magazines you worked for care about that?
Well, basically there is no truth in photography. Basically what you're dealing with is when the photographer presses the little button. And depending upon his point of view, the pictures you see will represent that. The best example is Alfred Eisenstadt photographed Goebbels, who was the information minister for Hitler. And Goebbels was sitting in a chair very stiffly with a dark suit. There was an aide standing over him, and he had this demonic look on his face. And 15 minutes before that, Eisenstadt had photographed him like smiling at somebody. So all these pictures went to Henry Luce, who was editor of Time magazine, and he had a choice of which picture to use, which was going to influence millions of people in the United States and elsewhere, and also really create an attitude of what the Nazi, regime was about to become or was becoming. And he did choose to do the demonic picture, which became a very well-known photograph. But there you go.
Did you have any thoughts on that, Quincy? Did you have any thoughts on objectivity in journalism?
Yeah.
You can leave it on.
No, I haven't had. I came along a little bit. I came along after Steve, and writing for the Village Voice and writing for Spin. I was writing about musicians, and but I was also writing some political pieces that some people didn't like at the Voice because it was, I guess, too cold-blooded. So they would edit it a lot, and we'd have big arguments, especially if I had a certain white editor. He didn't want that. And so I've had that problem, but not as much as Steve, because he was specifically going down to Mississippi and Louisiana, the South, and following the civil rights movement. I thought it was enough people writing about the civil rights movement, and then I was writing about other things. I didn't think I had to do that, because there were other people who were doing that really well. Not that I didn't feel I could do it, but I didn't think we needed to duplicate, in a way.
We were with Medgar Evers at his house, and pretty much as a joke, he took a towel and put it over the license plate of our car as if no one was looking. He was carefully being monitored, but it was just, a joke. And of course, 3 months later, he was killed.
This is just a beautiful photograph of these two men. And I really admire the way that you caught these moments of it. It makes me think, and we don't actually get a lot of imagery of intimacy between black men in general, and certainly not from that era. One thing that I was curious if either of you could talk more about, that I Am Not Your Negro did not really talk about James Baldwin as a gay figure or a queer figure, even though I think that is a major way that he is having this renaissance right now. He registers with people racially, but he is very much a patron saint of black queer people, particularly people who have been very instrumental in the Black Lives Matter movement. Did you know him as a gay person? When was that part of his identity in the way that you knew him?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Who was?
Can you say any more about that?
Well, I don't particularly judge anyone about anything. Basically, the way I like to photograph is being a fly on the wall, because it allows me to be able to move around and to really wait for a moment where I feel the sense of a person's spirit or the sense of an event in such a way that it shows you something about them. So, I worked a lot with Life, and you usually worked with a reporter, which made it very easy for you to either be very quiet and to be a fly on the wall and not have to reel it. If I have a conversation with you, half the picture, you're going to be thinking about me, and half the pictures are going to be with your mouth open, which isn't going to really show anything at all. And so, that's the way I like to work. Had great conversations with Alec Guinness and other people, but basically, I'm happiest that way.
You did the last interview with James Baldwin at his home in southern France.
Yes, 1987, a week before he died. And I didn't know. First of all, I want to say just kind of piggyback on what Steve was saying. Being a poet and a writer and being around a lot of painters and writers and musicians, I never judged anybody because of the fact that they were or homosexual or lesbian. I just never did. I was good friends with Allen Ginsberg. I was good friends with a whole bunch of people, and I let them know that I was not gay, and don't hit on me. Okay, so don't do that.
That's a good thing.
I mean, I just let them know that. You know what I mean? Because of the fact, then I would have another reaction. And I didn't.
Was he living with a partner at the end of his
Yeah,
life?
he was. Yeah. But Jimmy Baldwin never did that with me. Never. We were just friends. I mean, I didn't have to tell him that. He had a partner, and that was who he was with. So I never had that problem with him or Ginsberg or a lot of people that I know who are gay. But no, I'm really serious. I'm really speaking. A lot of people make a lot of that, but not with me.
I would say that at the time when I knew Jimmy, he was very lonely.
Yeah.
I think he drank too much. I think he smoked too much. But at the same time, his inner spirit was so strong and so important. I mean, he really was behind the scenes, but very actively behind the scenes, and not necessarily in the foreground of what was happening, but his voice was known very definitely.
And he supported me. I mean, he supported me. I just want to finish this about
Yeah.
the last interview. You know, he was always supported me, whatever I asked him. If I was teaching at the College of Staten Island. If I asked him to come over and give a lecture, he would. If I asked him to do this, come and do the Black Arts Movement. I mean, I did a festival called the Black Roots Festival, and he would do that. But I want to talk about the last interview, because the last interview was when I went down to interview him, because Miles Davis, I was writing his autobiography, said you have to interview Jimmy Baldwin. And I said, okay, you know him? I said, yeah. So he said, St. Paul Divine. So I said, okay. And so I didn't know he was dying. I knew he was sick because people had told me. And I go down, and David Baldwin, his brother, picked me up at the airport and told me on the ride up from St. Paul to where, I mean, from I think it was Nice, up to St. Paul. He told me, don't interview him just about Miles Davis. Interview him about everything, because this is probably going to be the last interview he does. I was shocked. I really was. And so when we get to his house, this beautiful house they had, I went in to interview him, and I would come and interview him. And we had to carry him out because he was very weak at that time. And I was there 5-6 days, and I interviewed him every day as long as his strength would hold up. And it was a remarkable interview. It really was a remarkable interview. And it's in this book, James Baldwin, The Legacy, where the last interview with him is there. And but so it was I just knew he was going. He knew it. I was there when the doctor came by on a Saturday night and said he only had probably at the most a week to live. I was there, and when he told David. And it was a very sad moment, you know, for us. But we knew it was coming. I was a pallbearer at his funeral at St. John the Divine, and there was a saying that came along, and a lot of people who knew him said, if you can't have a funeral like James Baldwin, you better not die, because it was packed, you know.
I want to, maybe we can, whoever has a clicker can scroll through some of the images. I want to, before we go into audience questions, talk a bit about Ferguson and ways we've talked about the civil rights movement, and in the past few years sort of thought of it as either the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century or the beginning of the civil rights movement. Is this from?
This is from Birmingham,
Okay.
actually. But there's a picture we're going to come to, which really represents a lot about, should be in there. Yeah.
So let's hold on this one for a minute.
That's the picture. This is 1965 in Selma, and it has so much bearing on today. And we're going through possibly something a little different from that, but very much like it in some ways.
Yeah, this was one of the first images when I read the book and looked through the pictures that really struck me as being so similar to what I've covered when I've been reporting in Ferguson. The phrasing is even the same, although I feel like, the phrasing is the same now, but we went through a period of years where that phrasing was not the primary message coming out of activism.
Right.
And now it's very present again. And I wanted to ask you sort of, what did you think when you heard about Ferguson, and you read one of the quotes about how Birmingham is now making America reckon with things that they want to think are unusual, they're actually quite usual. And the same can be said of Ferguson now. And what were your sort of initial thoughts, both about the activism you saw at Ferguson, but also a very different kind of visual landscape for how we receive this, right?
Well,
everyone has a camera in their pocket at all times.
Well, the difference also is that at that time, we saw a picture just before this of all these troopers and this protester laughing at the troopers, which was basically the attitude of the nonviolent movement. But at that point, all the police, all the sheriffs, everyone in law enforcement was against protesters, was against the civil rights movement. I think today the difference is I don't think that all police, are anti, anti-black, but I do feel you have, rogue people. Why do you become a policeman? You become a policeman, A, because you want to help people, or because you have a sense of violence within you and you want to get that out.
I vote for the latter.
Yeah. And, and that aspect of it we definitely are seeing.
I'm from St. Louis, see, and so I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and Ferguson is St. Louis, and so I can tell you, I was shocked when I saw Ferguson because there was so many Uncle Toms in St. Louis, Missouri. There was never anything there. Nobody stood up for anything. That's one of the reasons I left. You know what I mean? They would never stand up for anything. So when Ferguson happened, I was absolutely shocked. I told my wife, I was shocked because that was the first time that black people in St. Louis had stood up like that and really stood up. The police, I always thought were Gestapo in St. Louis. They were always Gestapo, always. And so that was no different. What we saw and I can tell you that going back a long ways, but what we saw on our television set with the armory and the guns that they had and all those tanks, it wasn't like that before. They would just shoot you on the streets out of their patrol cars. But now it was armed to the teeth with all kinds of weaponry, and those kids were standing up. I really, 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 I'm going to say this, I really felt proud of those black kids and some of those white kids that came down and stood with those kids in Ferguson, because I didn't think they would ever do it. I never thought they would do it. So I felt proud to be that they did it, and it came from Ferguson, and that ignited a lot of stuff in the United States. That really did.
Well, I live in Chicago, and I've been interested now in Father Flager, who really is to my mind, as the same voice as Dr. King did and John Lewis, and really is working there in terms of trying to deal with this situation, which is totally different than Ferguson in a way, in the sense that it's a situation where each block is a new country, and if you insult someone in a block next to you, it can lead to violence immediately. It's just a total different situation, but it's still an enormous problem today.
I just want to ask one last question, then I'll open it up to the audience. I co-taught a class at NYU last year called Unarmed Black Male. And in it, we looked at case studies from Rodney King to Tamir Rice of police violence, usually police killings. And I'm particularly interested from you, Steve. One of the things we notice is that there's a huge difference of communication from Rodney King, in which George Holliday shoots this video with relatively new technology, just happens to look out his balcony and shoots this beating on a VHS recorder, I think. And then, by the time you get to Tamir Rice, you have body cams and car cams, and everyone's walking around with a video camera, in essence, in their pocket at all times. And as a photojournalist, what do you think the role is of the photojournalist now? And do you feel like, having had such a career of documenting these terrible things happening, do you think that it does actually affect change when people see it?
Well, I think I wrote something in the book about things, and one of the things I mentioned was that Charles Moore was a photographer, and he did a series for Life magazine on the Birmingham situation when the dogs were unleashed on people and where they used the fire hoses. And Life published this in a big way, and it was seen by millions of people, and it's certainly one of the rare instances where photojournalism really changed the climate of a country and changed the attitudes of a country, and they looked at the South in a different way.
Thank you. I hope you've been thinking of questions, and we will move a mic around. Is there anything anyone would like to ask? Raise your hands. Miss Rosen. She always has something to say.
Always, Mrs. Shapiro. If you could give us a brief bio of your life before you became a photojournalist for life.
Well, when I was growing up, I was really taken by Cartier-Bresson's The Decisive Moment, and I would go out and try to do pictures like that of catching things at the height of their moment with good design and all. But I was always a few seconds late, and I'd come back with these context sheets which didn't make any sense at all. But finally I worked from that, and as I grew up at that time, there were no galleries and things like that, and the most you could aspire to as a young journalistic photographer who wanted to do that was to really work for life. And so I did my own projects to try to do that, and I went to Arkansas and I did a series on migrant workers, and particularly about the children who I was very taken by the fact that they probably were given like an hour of school and then they'd move on to another place, and basically they had no chance to really get out of the whole system, the migrant system and the migrant situation. And I brought that to, there was a small Catholic magazine called Jubilee, and they published it for 8 pages. And then the New York Times picked up with one of the pictures and put it on the magazine section. And then I did a picture on narcotics addiction in East Harlem. And I would keep bringing pictures up to life, and finally it worked out. And then I did a lot of documentary work and entertainment work, and then Life and Look folded. And basically what you have is a situation where some of the best photography that you've seen was really because an institution of some form was behind it. So you had the Farm Security Administration, which brought you Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange. You had Life magazine, which published a lot of Cartier-Bresson, a lot of W. Eugene Smith. But we don't have that as much today, and it's much harder. The period in which I worked in the 60s, at least, was called it was called the golden age of journalistic photography. It's much harder for young photographers today to be able to see their work, and magazines do things on hunger, poverty, but if someone has an essay which really involves human events or something like that, it's much harder for a young photographer to get established.
When I saw this book, one of the and I was actually going to ask, could we go back to the photo of the 2 girls? But when I saw your book, it reminded me of this Richard Wright book, 12 Million Black Voices, which is paired up with Wright's text with photos from the Farm Security Administration. The Farm Security Administration was part of the Works Progress and not the Great Society, the New Deal. For someone my age, the idea that you could encounter the crash of 2008 and have the government say, let's put people to work taking photos and doing oral histories, of course seems insane, but it's really beautiful. Yeah. And it's such a different way of thinking of the ability to photograph if you're actually supported in such a way that you can do work and not just be in hunger, poverty.
It's harder to finance it. This is actually 3 years before Diane Arbus.
Just tell us about this photo.
It just was one of those photos, again, in the course of a day, you take a lot of photographs, particularly this was during the Selma March, and I photographed people on the sides, and actually a lot of the photographs in this book I only discovered like 3 years ago when I was going back through my contact sheets, and I was unaware of a lot of the pictures which I really like now.
Other questions? Yes.
When you said you were in Ohio when you were doing some of your training before you went down south?
Yeah, it was a training session.
And were you in Yellow Springs, Ohio, do you recall?
It was in Canton, Ohio.
Oh, it was in Canton, Ohio. Because there were a lot of people from Yellow Springs who went down, and I thought maybe that you had...
They probably came to Canton or that.
They may have.
It was a big training center.
Yeah.
Bob Moses established it, and it was it was very effective. I mean, not only did it encourage people to vote, but it also, they did a lot of reading. There's a picture in the book of this middle-aged white woman with a whole bunch of kids around her, and she's reading a book with them. So it was a very intensive program and very, very positive.
Other questions?
Come on.
With today's current administration trying to stifle the press, are you worried about the press being able to then turn to the people and tell us what's going on and show us what's going on with their photographs? Are you worried, or do you think that the journalists and photojournalists are always going to prevail?
Worried about now?
Right now, yeah.
Well, I'm very worried about it now in general. You know, I mean, we have a situation which I think we're all aware of, and it's not a good situation. And it's a question of how you deal with that situation. And if you were to impeach this person, the person who took over might be pretty much, very much the same, or maybe worse. So we have, slowly all the people in government who head government are being replaced by people who represent, one particular person, I think. Yes, I'm extremely worried. And it's a question of who really can come through to change the course of things. I mean, usually people respond to someone who's charismatic, and they figure, yeah, I don't know it, but they really know. And I don't know that that's happening necessarily at this moment, because basically you need a charismatic leader who can unite a country which is very, very divided at this point. In the same sense that the South, the civil rights movement involved two very, very different perspectives on life. We have the same thing at the moment.
Do you think when you hear about Cal exit or blue states wanting to leave the United States and the blue state, red state divide, do you think that we are in a slow-moving civil war of the same kind that was happening in the 1960s?
Well, someone has to start the purple states.
They said this on C-SPAN this morning. About 4 or 5 people called in. First, I want to say Miles Davis once said, "If you're not nervous, you're not paying attention." You know what I mean? You're not paying attention. And Miles said that, and I always say that to people. But today on C-SPAN, in the morning show, Washington Journal or something, about 5 or 6 people called in and said, we're really close to a riot. We're really close to that happening all over the country. And one of the differences is, like, before, my wife is from Mississippi, and everybody used to define this thing as a north-south thing. But now we got upstate New York that is the South, and Wisconsin and Michigan and
Bay
Ohio. It's like, Ohio, because I used to teach at Ohio University. Don't tell me Athens is right there. So people, it is the same. It's really bad. It's really terrible now.
I think we're at a point where we have to come back to human values and to a value of human life. And I think that's like a very big question today. We have greed. We have, it's very strange to me that a lot of people who represent Trump really, he's not representing their interests. And, people vote emotionally. They don't vote on issues. And, we're living in a world where media and other aspects of things create people who can create that kind of charisma, and people just go, oh, yeah. I don't know.
Yes. You can ask anything you want.
Sure.
It's funny how it's okay. he's taken over our lives. Here we are talking about James Baldwin, and he enters like this. So I want to bring it back, if I may. I'd love to hear you describe the circumstances of the beautiful portrait in the overcoat in the snow of Mr. Baldwin.
The one.
He's standing in the overcoat.
Oh,
It's
okay.
so
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
Just in Harlem, we were walking around. We were walking with his nephew.
The one he wrote the letter to?
Yes. We were just taking a series of pictures, and again, you don't always know what picture is going to really reverberate. You know, I just found another picture of him, which I had never published before, and which I really, really like also, which has, for me, that same kind of reverberation. I don't know if it'll work for anyone else again. Thank you.
Hi, I have two questions for Mr. Shapiro. Are you still working? And if so, what kind of a camera do you use? And then for Mr. Troop, I'm curious as to how the interview with Mr. Baldwin has subsequently influenced your work since the interview.
I'm still working. The last published book I had before this was on Misericordia, which is a place in Chicago. It's a 31-acre campus in the middle of Chicago, or northern part of Chicago, where the Sister Rosemary started in 1974 for people who had developmental problems. And it's a joyous place. There are 600 residents and people who really sat in a dark room, or, you know, or maybe spent the day just sitting in a room or looking at television with a sense, many of them with a sense that other people were looking down upon them, suddenly have a joyous life which starts early at 9 in the morning, and they do work projects, they work on computers, and their whole personalities have blossomed. And it's an amazing experience. I went there, a lot of times my wife and I went together there, and we just came out smiling. So I did that project. I'm beginning to do much more in South Chicago. And then, you know, I still do a little street photography and stuff. I don't know.
What are you shooting with? What's your camera?
Well, I started with a Nikon because when in the 60s, Nikon came out with a camera, and it was like a three-finger camera. You could focus, you could take your picture and then advance it, and I could do bounce strobe with my other hand, which gave a particular sense. You didn't have a sense that there was a photographer, there was just an even lighting. So I started with that. Like I had to use two hands, and basically I stuck with Nikon, so I've gone through most of their cameras. At the moment I'm using digital cameras. I'm using an E800, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to go back to black and white now. Film camera.
During the last interview with James Baldwin, you know, he was such a great man for me, you know, growing up and everything. And you know, people like that, you don't ever think about them dying, you know, in a way. You know everybody's going to die, you know. You do, including yourself. But you don't think of it. And I didn't think of it. So when I saw that he had lost all this weight, and I was carrying him in to eat every day, either me or his brother, David, would carry him from his bedroom in to eat at the table. It hit me, you know, and he was totally honest with me. He was just totally honest about all kinds of things. And I thought that I have to be in a hurry. I have to be in a hurry in getting stuff done. I have to get all this work done that I'm doing, you know, because I know it was some things he wanted to get done. He wasn't going to be able to get them done. So from that moment on, I was always, and I have always been in a hurry to get my stuff done, you know, what I have to do. You know, I'm concentrating and focusing on that. And to be truthful, and to be honest, because he taught me that. He was totally honest, you know, and brutally honest, you know. So that's one of the main things. And he was such a beautiful spirit inside, you know. That.
Is that Bayard Rustin?
This is,
Yeah.
it's Bayard Rustin and a Philip Randolph. This is in Selma when the march had arrived. And you can see Jimmy got up there. Now, Jimmy was just a civilian in this. You know, but you can see how everyone felt about him and how those two people in particular felt about him. And you know, how much his influence was felt behind the scenes, really.
I just wanted to return to the topic of Jimmy being gay for a minute. And the question's not really, were you ever worried whether he would come on to you? The question's whether he was ever worried that being gay would be used against him and used to undermine his involvement in the struggle. Whether you ever got that sense from him at all?
I never got that sense from him. I never got that sense from him. A person who will remain nameless in this situation. Jimmy thought that he called him a faggot, and he told me, because I knew this person. You tell so and so, I am not a faggot. I will come out there and beat his ass. I will come out there and do that to him. That's what he told me. He told me, I said, well, I'm not going to tell him that. You tell him, you know, I'll give you his number. You call him and tell him. But he was never, for me, it never bothered him.
I think if you know who you are, and if internally you know who you are and you have faith in yourself, that none of that matters, really. I mean, what people say to you doesn't matter, really. I mean, if you know who you are and really know who you are and what your role is in life, none of that matters.
And I think, thank you for that question. I think that it was beautiful to see Bayard Rustin in the photograph that we were just looking at as well, who was very out and paid a price, but King also kept him in the circle, and he was the architect of the March on Washington. And these two men are very influential, I think, in not just our general political moment, but they have a very strong role in the Black Lives Matter movement and the people who are thinking through that and creating that. We have time for how many more questions?
One or two more questions.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions.
I'm delighted to see so many young people here, which is not always the case. I think it's fair to say that James Baldwin receded for a while from public memory. Why do you think it's the case that he is so relevant, and particularly to young people today?
Why do I think?
To me, he's been a figure in my life in some way for a while, but in the past few years, particularly not just as gay rights, as I call them, but also sort of queer thinking has evolved. Both Bayard Rustin and James Baldwin have been very present. And I think that he just speaks such a truth that resonates with people. I've been in... I've seen I Am Not Your Negro here. I was on a panel for its Swiss premiere in Geneva, Switzerland, because the movie was co-produced by the Swiss government. And so he's not always been as received as well in the United States as he is in other countries. But it's amazing to see people from different societies who are really resonating with what he's saying. And there's an image, I often tweet this meme of him where he's saying, coming back to a quote you'd said, very similar, you said about Miles Davis, Baldwin says, to be a Negro in this country and relatively conscious means to be in a rage almost all the time. And I think that is something that has just registered so powerfully with people. And I do think that there is such a different media environment now. You write about taking your photographs, putting them on a plane, sending them somewhere. They get developed. Some of them you don't come back to until decades later. We're at this moment now where things are happening and people are responding quite quickly. And I think that Baldwin really helps make sense of how to be with it and not ignore it, to be conscious about it, but also not lose your damn mind, or try not to lose your mind as it's happening. Why do you think he's having this moment now?
I don't know what to say. I mean, really, I think it's amazing and wonderful and deserving in every way. I don't know how things happen.
I just think that a lot of see now, I mean, the whole idea of being gay and all of that is more accepted now than it was long time ago. I mean, so that's what I'm saying. He was a courageous, heroic figure. He was out front. He was out front, always was out front. And when I guess, I don't know. I can't speak for young people. They have to speak for themselves. But I think the ones that I've talked to talk about how they see him as a heroic figure. And I've talked to a number of young people about Baldwin. I talk about him around the country, and that's what they say. So I have to go with that, because I'm not a young person.
So we'll take one last question from the audience.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I wanted us to really go back to Baldwin. I knew Baldwin, but that's irrelevant. I knew him in his work, and I meet him in his work, and I embrace him in his work. I'm curious about why people come to his work, because it's so much now, so much history, so much written about him, that people have some idea about who they think he is when they come to his literature. And I think, how does this human being emerge? How does he emerge? When you look at how he comes into life and living in Harlem, etc., etc., etc. So often we focus on a particular aspect of his life. He never separated those things. He talked about himself as a total human being. So I want to ask if you will comment on how you see the integration of him as a person, as a man, inside the literature that he creates, and the literature that he creates, how it then comes out and affects us.
I think that James Baldwin, for me, I'm going to say for me, as a writer, and I think Toni Morrison would say the same thing, and a lot of people would say the same thing. James Baldwin, for me, created the modern American sentence. Okay, he created the modern American sentence, because Baldwin, I swear, he wrote like he spoke. I mean, if you read his sentences, you are listening to him speak as a person in the flesh. Now, that's very difficult for people to do. Most people think they have to leave that aside and create this other voice. Baldwin had the voice that everybody wanted to imitate, including me. So that's how he influenced me to try to write like I speak, coming from St. Louis and Missouri in that diction, growing up in the Baptist church, you see, and growing up with the music, to write in that way that is authentic. Authentic. James Baldwin had an authentic American voice, like Mark Twain did. Authentic voice. So I think that's part of it. And that's why so many people turned out at his funeral, black and white, and Chinese, and Latino, at St. John the Divine, 10,000 people at his funeral, and that's saying if you can't have no funeral like James Baldwin, you better not die. You know what I mean? And so that is special.
To close us out, I just want to ask you, Mr. Schapiro, you write because we are in this room together and we have this opportunity to hear from you. You write in the book about being in Memphis the day Martin Luther King is assassinated, and you go to right after you go to the room from where he was shot, and then you also go into the room at the Lorraine Motel where he had been. And so just close this out tonight, because we have you as this griot. Lewis writes about James Baldwin as our griot, and you are also our griot and still with us. So please tell us about this moment in American history when you're in this room being with sort of the ephemera of a person who is so big to us and who had just left us.
Well, I was in New York, and Life called me, and they said, Dr. King's been shot. We'd like you to fly immediately to Memphis, which I did. And when I got there, I first went to the rooming house where the shots had been fired. It's not like today where you have all these yellow ribbons, these yellow things around. There was really no security whatsoever. I went to the second floor bathroom, and the assailant had stood in the bathtub and leveled his gun on the window, and I saw a black handprint on the wall, which could only have been made by someone who had been standing in the bathtub, which is not what people usually do. And I photographed that, and Life ran that the next week as a full page. I went to the motel room, and Hosea Williams was there, was one of King's aides, and he let me in, and I saw on a ledge Dr. King's attaché case with a few books, one of which I had done the cover for, and I saw old styrofoam cups. I saw rumpled shirts just lying there on this ledge, and then suddenly on the television set, which was right above it, I saw behind this commentator the image of King, and I photographed it all as just one picture because I felt that for me, symbolically, the physical man was gone forever. His material things remained, and yet his spirit hovered above us. And I felt it was a significant moment and a picture which I really care about. Life used to clip sprocket holes in pictures they would do for publication. It never was clipped or anything like that, but it's a picture for me which is very, very strong about my feelings. Both those images are strong. The Lorraine Motel is now I guess a civil rights museum. They took the motel room, the motel housing, they took the rooming house and they just gutted it so that it was just brick walls, but they took this bathroom and pushed it out with a plexiglass window so you could see in, and it showed the bathtub and the window, but the wall in which the handprint was on was gone. It was just like a plain wall. And then I went to Dr. King's motel room, and again there was a plexiglass so you could see into the room, but it was really the wall where his attaché case had been and where the television had been, and so those were all gone. So the two things which were most emotional for me about the situation no longer existed, but this is a national monument or a civil monument or something like that.
Well, thank you for being a national monument for us. Please help me give a round of applause to these two gentlemen.